Okay, day 57 of 365 days of meditation. This video is kind of long and complicated. I tried to shoot it already a couple times and I keep making it too long and talking in circles. So here we go. We'll try again. Today's meditation I just wrapped up a little while ago, and it was a psychological and physiological continuous kick in the scrotum for about an hour, I would say. I meditated for about an hour and 15 minutes, but about an hour of it was pretty emotionally brutal and exhausting, to be entirely honest. I went in and kind of sat down. I was feeling anxious. I've been feeling sort of this, I mentioned the other day, just kind of getting angry while I was driving, a little bit of road rage. And when I sat down today, there was that sort of rage I was scraping up against in my subconscious again, my psyche, and it was just boiling under the surface, and I kind of just sat with it, and there was definitely some, tears that started to flow, and just feelings of rage and outrage. And then that led to self-loathing and self-hatred. And in addition to feeling these emotions, I was sort of, what was popping into my mind, I wasn't doing it intentionally, but what was popping into my mind was the experiences with negative experiences with my own mental health when I was younger, and even into my adulthood, at different times. And rage and outrage turned to self-loathing and hatred, and recalling of all the experiences and times when I felt that before, when I was struggling with my mental health. And then that turned into desperation, despair, hopelessness, just suffering, and flood of memories coming back. And my wife told me the other day that, I think she said that you're only able to cry for about 2 or 3 minutes straight, and then you stop. I don't know if that's true, but if that was happening, then I was probably crying for 2 or 3 minutes and then stopping for 10, 15, 30 seconds, a minute, and then going again for another 2 or 3 minutes. It seemed like it was almost continuous. But rough, about an hour of that. And just I don't know how to describe it. Just felt like poison pouring out of my brain. So anyway, that was the meditation itself. Not all that pleasant, but I got through it. In relation to that, I was watching or listening to a podcast yesterday and today, an Andrew Huberman episode on fear and trauma, and extinguishing fear or trauma and trauma. And that was really interesting and sort of timely, because I think I haven't finished the episode yet, but a couple takeaways. I'll try to share them as best I can. One of them was the idea that in order for particular types of behavioral therapy to work to help extinguish fear, trauma, whether it's prolonged exposure, cognitive processing, or cognitive behavioral therapy, the first step is to recall the traumatic or fear-filled event or events that occurred and articulate them in as much detail as possible, because in those therapies you're actually talking it through. Or if you journal about it, to journal about them as much detail as possible if you're not working with a clinician. For myself, I guess I'm not working with a clinician and I'm not journaling about it, but I am going into meditation and recounting them in a tremendous amount of detail, as I did today. It's not even intentional. It just seems to I end up there. I ended up there today. I have in the past done it intentionally, and almost sort of intentionally in some ways. Whatever sort of pops up, I will explore that emotion, and sometimes an experience from my past child or when I was younger will pop up. and I'll go into it and I'll sort of do that Buddhist meditation practice where I'll, revisit myself, console myself, or whatever. But I am recalling that event and the emotions around it, and invoking that sort of physiological anxiety response attached to that memory when I do it, just as I did today, which, I didn't intentionally do that Buddhist practice today, just sort of poured out. But yeah, that is a necessity to sort of extinguish the trauma and fear. You have to go back and recount it in as much detail as possible and do it repetitively. And the more you do it, I guess it's almost sort of like desensitizing yourself to the original event. It becomes less and less and less sort of emotionally charged as a result of recounting it over and over again. Apparently, this is what the episode says. So, eventually the idea is that this sort of terrible, troubling psychological and physiological experience, and the narrative around it starts to change, and it becomes just a terrible and troubling experience that is so familiar that it's almost boring. It doesn't carry that same emotional amplitude anymore. So it's almost like desensitizing yourself to your own past experiences, which is interesting because when we learn, we recall things over and over again, and by recalling them over and over again, and through whatever the practice is, it actually wires it in your brain, wires it to memory. So it's interesting that by recalling this, it almost weakens the response. I don't know why exactly. I don't know the details. I can't recall the details anyway. It has to do with the way your amygdala is hooked into the rest of your brain. But yeah, that's sort of the first step, is to recall it until you almost desensitize yourself to it and it's not evoking such an emotional response. And then the second step is to create a new narrative around the experience or experiences. So, when you're doing something that is sort of overcoming that past experience or flies in the face of that fear or that trauma, you're doing something that normally you wouldn't do, because it was, it would trigger you, to sort of acknowledge that you're doing it even though you've had that negative experience. That's the one suggestion that came up in the podcast. But it seems to me like people do that when they take their past traumatic experiences or negative experiences in their life and then use it to fuel sort of a career or purpose. Somebody who struggled with mental health becoming a psychologist, or somebody who's had a family member that had a horrible accident and was injured or killed in front of them, and then they become a paramedic or a firefighter or something, to help other people. It seems like taking the negative events in your life and then using them as fuel to help other people who might be experiencing a similar event might also be a good way of sort of reframing a negative event that occurs. At least that's what I was thinking when I was watching the podcast. Yeah, the last bit of information about the podcast that I found interesting was this idea of trauma being passed down through generation, and how research shows that probably what's happening is there's a gene or a series of genes or a number of genes that makes the offspring of usually a father. Apparently it's usually passed down from the father. So the father donates his genetic material, and the child, if the father was exposed to a lot of trauma beforehand, the child is more likely to have this genes or set of genes that makes them more likely to be sort of hypersensitive to potentially fearful or traumatic events, so that they have a greater sort of anxiety response, or more likely to be traumatized by them. And then also with a traumatic event, the intensity of the trauma that they sort of, experience is of a greater amplitude. And it seems to be biological. At least that's what some of this research points out. I haven't looked at it myself. I'm just going by this podcast. So those were sort of that was sort of the bit of information that I found most interesting. When I think about the reframing things, I guess from a meditative practice, what I'm doing in reframing is sort of accepting them, but then also I think a gratitude practice, when I do gratitude practice in meditation, especially if I'm able to be grateful or find gratitude in a past negative experience, sort of find the silver lining, or how it's shaped my life in a positive way, then that's maybe the reframing that gets done. So yeah, interesting to see how meditation is both sort of exposing myself to that physiological anxiety response, and hopefully if I do it enough times, it'll take down the intensity of it. And then the gratitude practice that I do is sort of maybe the reframing, if I'm able to find the silver lining in these past negative experiences, and be grateful for them. So yeah, never knew that's what I was doing, but apparently maybe that's what I'm doing in meditation. So we'll see if it works. We got 300 some odd days to go still. I'm either going to be feeling a lot better about the past suffering that I endured when I was struggling with my mental health for 25, 30 years, or I'm going to be in a straitjacket. We'll see. I'm going to keep going anyway. So yeah, that's it for today. I'm sure there was something else I wanted to say, but I can't remember what it is. This episode's already getting a little bit long, so let's just say wrap up and say that if you are struggling with your mental health at all, the evidence is right there. Talk to somebody. You're verbalizing that trauma or fear, that experience, and in doing so, you're going to reduce the amplitude of that anxiety response and help extinguish the fear or trauma that you experienced. So yeah, I never knew that before. I never necessarily knew the mechanism, so to speak, or the why. But yeah, definitely talk to somebody. There's another handful of reasons there in this episode, and I will link to that Huberman Lab podcast episode. If you're interested, you can check it out. There's a wealth of information. I haven't even got through it all yet, but yeah. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and it's almost the New Year, so I guess tomorrow I'll be saying Happy New Year, or the next day. Tomorrow's New Year's Eve. Yeah. Have a good day.